Her black young girl secretly fed a broke millionaire every day. One night 15. Cops showed up. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Enjoy it. The foil crinkled between her trembling fingers as she wrapped the second sandwich, the sound echoing through the pre-dawn silence of the cramped kitchen. 16-year-old Delilah Washington moved like a ghost through the shadows, her bare feet barely touching the cold linoleum. The foster house slept around her, unaware of the ritual that had become her secret salvation. She slipped the warm package into her worn backpack, alongside a thermos of hot chocolate steam still rising from its mouth like whispered prayers. Outside, Chicago's South Side wore its winter coat of frost and desperation. Delilah pulled her thin jacket tighter as she stepped into the biting December air, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated like her dreams. She walked with purpose. Down the cracked sidewalk, past boarded windows and forgotten hopes toward the alley that had become her daily destination. The challenges began the moment she set foot in Lincoln High School. "Look what the streets dragged in," sneered Jessica, Martinez, the principal's daughter, her voice dripping with inherited authority. Delilah kept her eyes down, clutching her textbooks like armor against the daily assault of whispers and stares. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the fluorescent lights, making her appear smaller, more vulnerable. "She thinks she's better than us." With her fancy notebooks, another student whispered, not caring that Delilah could hear every word. The truth was simpler and more painful. Her notebooks were filled with code, mathematical equations, and dreams of Silicon Valleys that felt as distant as the moon. Mrs. Henderson, her computer science teacher, barely glanced up when Delilah submitted her programming assignment. "Adequate," she murmured, though the code was flawless, innovative even. When Jessica turned in her half-finished project the next day, Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. "Excellent progress, dear. You show such natural talent." At home, her foster mother, Carol Jenkins, counted the grocery money with suspicious precision. "Food's disappearing too fast," she announced during dinner, her eyes boring into Delilah. "Someone's being greedy." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Delilah swallowed her meager portion in silence, knowing her morning kindness had cost her evening hunger. Behind the dumpster on Mason Street, Edwin Harwood waited in his cocoon of newspaper and cardboard. His eyes, once sharp enough to navigate million-dollar deals, now struggled to focus on the approaching figure. "You came back," he whispered, his voice a broken instrument. 7 years of living on the streets had carved hollows in his cheeks and stolen the confidence from his shoulders. "I promised I would," Delilah replied, kneeling beside him despite the stench and the cold seeping through her jeans. She placed the warm sandwich in his shaking hands, watching as tears carved clean paths down his dirt-stained cheeks. This was her church, her communion, her small act of rebellion against a world that had forgotten both of them. The unexpected turning point came on a Tuesday that felt like any other. Delilah sat in the public library, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the precision of a pianist. The screen glowed with city records, archived newspaper articles, and forgotten databases. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just following the digital breadcrumbs that Edwin had dropped in their conversations about his past life. Then, she found it. Edward S. Harwood, former CEO of Harwood Investments, reported missing 7 years ago. Presumed dead. The photograph showed a man in an expensive suit, his eyes bright with ambition. It was unmistakably Edwin before the streets had claimed him. The revelation hit her like lightning. She printed the documents with shaking hands, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the magnitude of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just about feeding a homeless man anymore. This was about restoring a stolen identity, a lost life. Back at school, the cruelty escalated. During lunch, 3 students cornered her in the hallway. "Charity case thinks she's special," Marcus Thompson spat, grabbing her backpack and dumping its contents onto the floor. Her precious notebooks scattered like wounded birds, pages filled with code and dreams splayed open for mockery. "Maybe she should go back where she came from," Jessica added, her voice sharp as broken glass. A teacher walked by, saw the scene, and continued walking. The silence was its own form of violence. Delilah gathered her papers with quiet dignity, her movements precise despite the trembling in her hands. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, that silence was often the only armor available to the powerless. That night, she made her decision. Using an anonymous email account, she sent the documents about Edwin's true identity to the address she'd found for the Harwood family. Her finger hovered over the send button for 10 minutes before she finally pressed it, not knowing she was about to change everything. 3 days later, the sirens arrived at Lincoln High School, like harbingers of a reckoning no one had anticipated. 15 police officers, 3 black government cars, and a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter storms stepped onto the school's cracked pavement. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. Students pressed against windows, teachers whispered in hallways, and the principal's face went pale as parchment. The woman in the expensive coat moved through the corridors like a force of nature, her heels clicking against the linoleum with military precision. When she found Delilah sitting quietly in study hall, the entire room fell silent. "You're the girl who sent this," the woman said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She held up a manila folder, its contents spilling slightly. Behind her stood a man in an expensive suit, his jaw clenched with barely contained fury. Delilah looked up from her notebook, her expression calm despite the chaos swirling around her. "Yes, Mum, I did." The confrontation reached its crescendo in the principal's office. The woman who had introduced herself as Margaret Harwood leaned across the desk like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage you've caused to our family?" "I found a man who was dying," Delilah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her chest. "I found out who he really was." The man beside, Margaret, her brother Thomas, stepped forward, his face twisted with disgust. "You exploited a mentally ill man for attention. You're nothing but a foster child looking for her 15 minutes of fame." The words hit like physical blows, but Delilah remained standing, her spine straight as steel. She had faced worse accusations, survived greater indignities. This was just another test of her resolve. The moment of greatest tension arrived when the office door opened and Edwin stepped inside. But this wasn't the broken man from the alley. Clean-shaven, wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on his frame, he looked like a resurrection made flesh. His eyes, clear for the first time in years, found Delilah across the room. "There she is," he whispered, his voice carrying 7 years of gratitude. "The girl who saved my life." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Thomas stumbled backward as if struck. The man they had been told was a dangerous vagrant. The one they had come to protect their family from was their father. "Dad." Margaret's voice cracked like breaking ice. "We thought. The police said you were—" Edwin's transformation was complete now, not just in appearance but in presence. He stood taller, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Dead crazy. I was lost, but I was never gone. And when the whole world forgot my name, this child remembered my humanity." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters materialized from nowhere, cameras flashed, and suddenly Delilah found herself at the center of a story that would make headlines across the country. But she barely heard the commotion. Her eyes were fixed on Edwin, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a charity case or a broken man, but as someone who had simply needed to be seen. The resolution came swiftly, like dawn breaking after the longest night. The Harwood family, their guilt and gratitude intertwined like twisted rope, offered Delilah everything they thought she wanted: a new home, private school, a trust fund that would secure her future. The media called her a hero, a young woman who had restored a family and exposed the invisible crisis of homelessness in America. But that night, as news vans lined the streets outside her foster home, Delilah sat in her small basement room and made a different choice. She would accept their help, but on her terms. She would use their resources to build something lasting, something that would ensure no one else would have to choose between being invisible and being seen. The inspiring conclusion came 6 months later, when Delilah stood before the Chicago City Council, no longer the silent girl who had wrapped sandwiches in the dark. Dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, her natural hair framing her face like a crown, she announced the creation of the Invisible Hands Foundation. Using the Harwood family's resources and her own programming skills, she had built an app that connected homeless individuals with resources, families, and communities. "Every person has a name," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Every person has a story, and every person deserves to be seen. In the gallery, Edwin sat beside his reunited family, tears streaming down his face. Mrs. Henderson, who had dismissed her programming abilities, now watched from the back row with a mixture of awe and regret. The foundation grew rapidly, spreading to other cities, other forgotten corners of America. But Delilah never forgot the lesson. Learned in that alley behind the dumpster, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see someone, acknowledge their humanity, and refuse to let them disappear. As she walked across the stage at her high school graduation 2 years, later valedictorian and bound for MIT on a full scholarship, Delilah caught sight of Edwin in the audience. He mouthed 2 words that needed no voice: "Thank you." She smiled, remembering the girl who had once been invisible, and realized that sometimes the greatest revolution begins with the smallest act of kindness. Because in a world that thrives on making people disappear, the most radical thing you can do is help them remember their own names. Sometimes the most powerful people are those the world chooses not to see. Real change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it rises from the bottom up, carried by hands that have known hunger and hearts that have known neglect. When we choose to see the invisible, we don't just change their world, we transform our own. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.